I'm hoping you'll all be my friends yet after this. This final part begins with an episode called Demi-Monde Don Juan. From puberty until quite old age, I have always been cursed with a surfeit of testosterone. In high school and college, the hormone drove the secretion of oil from my scalp and skin, forcing me to crew cut my hair until the age of 30, or risk looking like I'd stuck my head in a tub of Vaseline every morning before breakfast. Only after the invention of hairspray would I be able to let my hair grow out to ordinary lengths. A more devastating effect of the steroid hormone, however, was the acne that disfigured my face so horribly. My senior yearbook picture had to be airbrushed to the point where I could hardly recognize the almost handsome portrait that was placed above my name in the yearbook. The scars have lingered all my life. Now, in old age, they break up the wrinkles in my skin, resulting in my seeming to be a little bit younger than I actually am. It's a paradox that despite the obvious excess of testosterone, and despite my heavy lifting activities on the farm during my teens, I never developed a characteristically masculine physique. My younger brother, Ted, working no harder than I did, and truth be told, I don't think he worked as hard, ended up looking like Mr. America. I never developed any muscular definition at all. In my early 40s, another testosterone-related problem brought misery to my life: benign prostatic hypertrophy. It gave rise to a never-ending fear of developing prostate cancer. Beginning in 1990, I would be subjected to periodic transrectal needle biopsies, over 90 altogether, before I told my urologist, enough already, I'll die of something else. As bad as the physical effects of excess testosterone were, the psychological effects were far worse. My need for sex became insatiable. I became the hopeless slave of desire. Now, just several months after my brush with death by suicide, the same steroid hormone that had pushed me to the edge of doom was now enlisting me in a monomaniacal, dangerous pursuit of seduction. The sailor boys and soldier boys wished for by 4-year-old Frankie, as he stood in a wash tub by a pot-bellied stove, would be replaced for grown-up Frank by actual soldiers and sailors and Marines, especially Marines. The more masculine, the straighter, the more they reminded me of the bully boys who had made the misery of my childhood, the more furiously I pursued them. As soon as I turned 21 and could buy Colt 44 and wine, my ability to seduce the straightest men became prodigious. Somehow I developed an instinct that allowed me to tell if a seduction wasn't going to work. Almost never did I make a move that was hostilely rejected. Eventually, sexual seduction began to resemble stamp collecting. Married men with children, a father and son combination, athletes, scientists, lawyers, doctors, journalists. One after the other, every object of desire became an entry in my album, another notch in my holster. Very few of my scores were gay men, although a fair number proved to be bisexual. Although I would come to have a fairly large number of gay friends, almost never was sex a part of our relationships. One of the few exceptions was an Episcopal bishop from the Toledo region, honest to godless. Our affair lasted for several years, ending a month before my marriage to Anne. Deeply conscientious, he would not, quote, dishonor the sanctity of marriage, even though there was no real impediment to continuing our liaison. Anne, newly styling herself an atheist after reading Man and His Gods, was quite amused by the thought of her atheist husband cavorting with an Episcopal bishop. The only other affair with a gay partner that I can recall involved a nuclear physicist. He was directing Westinghouse's research project attempting to build an atomic fusion reactor. We would meet every year at the annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the AAAS, and once at a meeting of the New York Academy of Sciences. Our affair lasted for 6 years, until he died of prostate cancer in his early 60s. The bar scene. One of the reasons I had so few affairs with gay men, apart from my not being attracted to effeminate men, probably was my total inability to pick up masculine homosexual men in gay bars. For them, I was too effeminate and too scarred with acne. I was a meat rack reject. My troubles began the first time I learned of the existence of a gay bar, shortly after I turned 21. I was in St. Joseph, across the river from Benton Harbor, my hometown. The moment I entered the bar, all eyes were fixed on me for a moment, taking my measure and computing my value. The eyes quickly shifted to other targets. I wasn't even worth looking at. The bar was well populated, but far from full. There were half a dozen empty stools left at the bar. Nervously, I approached an empty stool, not far from the entrance, beside an Italian-looking fellow who didn't seem to be with a partner. I sat down on the stool. The handsome bartender came over and took my order for a glass of Chianti. "You shouldn't order Chianti here," the fellow beside me sneered. "It's hog swill. You should order Cabernet Sauvignon or Chateauneuf du Pape." "Really? I've never had any papal wine. Does the Pope own a winery?" "Oh my God! Are you serious? You've never heard of Chateauneuf du Pape?" "No. It's $300 per bottle." "Well, I guess that's why I have to drink Chianti." By the way, my name is Frank. I'm Michael. And I got a call from him this morning, as I just told you. In less than 5 minutes, we were engaged in a furious argument on the relative merits of Max Bruch versus Ernest Bloch as composers. The argument ended in a stalemate, and the discussion inevitably turned to religion. I said I was an atheist, and Michael indicated he was Catholic, sort of. "I'm descended from Pope Boniface VIII, he declared. "Really? You're related to the infamous Pope Boniface VIII? The author of the outrageous bull, Unum Sanctam, the guy Dante put in the 8th circle of hell?" "Not just related, I'm descended from him. His real name was Benedetto Caetani. When he became Pope, he moved both his husbands and his wives into the papal apartments. I'm descended from him. He's an ancestor of mine. That's why his coat of arms is on my stationery." Michael then told the story, essentially corroborated the following year when I took a course in medieval history at the University of Michigan, of how Cardinal Caetani had become Pope. As would happen a number of times in the history of the papacy, a pope had died, in this case it was Pope Nicholas IV, leaving a college of cardinals evenly divided between French and Italian representatives. The conclave was deadlocked for 2 years, and finally a completely unknown person, Pietro da Marone, an Italian hermit living in France, was chosen as a compromise to sit upon the chair of Peter. He took the name of Celestine V and took up residence in Naples. There, with the help of Benedetto Caetani, Michael's ancestor, he remodeled part of the papal apartments to resemble a monk's cell in a monastery. Unbeknownst to the bumpkin pope, Caetani installed a speaking tube in the wall behind the papal bed. Every night, hours after the successor to St. Peter had fallen asleep, a celestial voice would tell him, "You are unworthy to sit upon the throne of Peter. You must abdicate." After 5 months and 8 days in office, he resigned. He would be the only so-called legitimate pope to abdicate until extremely recent times, when Razzi the Nazi, Benedict the 16th, resigned and took up residence in Castel Gandolfo with his handsome German secretary. During the brief and feckless rule of Celestine, Caetani managed to finagle a change in the makeup of the College of Cardinals. When Celestine abdicated, Caetani engineered his own election and took the name of Boniface VIII. Apparently, I really was sitting beside a descendant of a pope. I wondered how many other people now living are, knowingly or unknowingly, descended from a pope. I, however, am pretty sure that I'm not, that there are no popes in my woodpile. I have no known French or Italian ancestors. My only known ancestors are Austrian and German, and there has only been one German pope. And he's, well, you know, I mean, he doesn't, okay. Meanwhile, back at the bar with Elvis. It was now getting late, around 11:30, and the bar had become quite crowded. I just happened to be glancing at the entrance door, just left of the piano bar in front of the street side window, as 3 men entered. I sized them up, sort of the way I had been examined and evaluated when I myself had entered. One of them looked somehow familiar. The hairdo, the high collar, the western shirt open a third of the way down the front, about 6 feet tall. Oh my God, it was Elvis, with 2 bodyguards. He saw me gawking at him. "What are you looking at, zit face? Do you think somebody's going to pick you up?" For once in my life, I was speechless. Elvis and his men ventured a short distance into the crowded bar. He slowly sized up the clientele and then turned around towards the entrance. "Let's get the fuck out of this shithole." It was an Elvis sighting before he had died. What was he doing in St. Joseph, Michigan? There had been no publicity about him coming to Michigan. Possibly he was performing in Chicago, 90 miles away. But what in the world was he doing in a gay bar in a tiny town like St. Joe? How do Presbyterians answer that question? From the Bureau of Bisexual Affairs. One of my bisexual partners was a football player I had encountered shortly after he had graduated from high school. His first job, really, was with the police force in St. Joseph, Michigan. For 2 years, sex in a cop car was to be a part of my life. We remained good friends for many years, even after he married and fatefully went to work as a technician at a nuclear power plant. Many years later, when Anne, Catherine, and I had just left New York and settled into our home in Ohio, he drove down from Michigan to visit me for one last tryst. He had brain cancer, probably caused by radiation absorbed at work. Augie would die of glioblastoma multiforme before turning 40. That visit was destined to be the last gay experience of my life. Another bisexual man in my life was in his early 40s when we met. He owned a bowling alley and drove an expensive sports car, a white 1957 Ford Thunderbird convertible. On several occasions, late at night, he would drive me out onto the newly completed I-94 freeway near my home. Then, when he came to climax, he would jam his foot onto the accelerator and 193 horses under the hood would jolt us forward into the night at over 100 miles an hour. The danger was delicious. Often he would seek my service with one or more of his married buddies in tow. For those adventures, we took always my car and parked it. a third bisexual man. The most important in terms of how he changed the entire course of my life was David D.V. I had picked him up in Ann Arbor during the first year of my studies at the University of Michigan. He was an officer in the Air Force Reserves. I think he was a second lieutenant, but he was working as a high-power salesman for a scientific instruments company. Whether it was to make me jealous or to stimulate jealous passion, I never figured out, but he frequently talked about a woman he was dating. Her name was Anne Hunt, and she was famous for the parties she hosted in her small apartment on the third floor of a house on South State Street. He called them salons and told me about the salons of the French Enlightenment. That was the first I had ever heard of Madame de Staël. When he taught me of all the high-power intellectual interactions available at Anne's gatherings, I wanted him to get me an invitation. We'll have to wait for an opportunity, he told me. Her apartment is small, and I can't just drag friends along. As months flew by, it began to seem that he was deliberately not getting me invited to Anne's parties. I began to think he didn't want her to meet me, even though he had clearly told her a lot about me, and often regaled me with stories about what had happened at her most recent party. At one of the salons, for example, a guy named Larry had built a clock out of cardboard, paper clips, and rubber bands. It actually kept time, sort of. Finally, I managed to finagle an invitation to attend one of Anne's salons. It was a disaster. Anne made weapons-grade martinis, but I was quite accustomed to drinking moderate amounts of alcohol without problems. I had only had one drink, and I had decided it would be enough for the evening. There were more people at the party than there were places to sit, and so I was seated cross-legged on the carpet, arguing quantum physics, probably the implications of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, with a guy who was similarly ensconced. Time seemed to go into slow motion. The pattern in the carpet became bigger and bigger, closer and closer. And then I awoke in the bathroom. Dave and another guy were suspending my head and shoulders over the toilet. As soon as I was completely conscious, I began to barf into the toilet. Over and over again, every 15 minutes or so, another wave of nausea and chills would grip me. I couldn't get out of the bathroom long enough for other people to use it. Fortunately, a postdoc from Oxford who lived across the hall from Anne, had gone back to England for a holiday and had left her keys with Anne so that Anne could take care of her tropical fish during her absence. Anne unlocked that apartment so her guests could use the bathroom during my enduring occupation of the commode. After several hours, the nausea ended, and I spent the rest of the night on the couch in the neighbor's apartment. I never received another invitation until after graduation. That debacle would prove to be the first paroxysmal occurrence of a mystery disease that would plague me on and off for the rest of my life. Only when I was in my early 60s would it finally be diagnosed: silent migraines. I never had a headache, but every possible side effect associated with migraines would be experienced sooner or later. Nausea and vomiting, diarrhea, chills, fever, passing out, even electrolyte shock, everything except headaches. The diagnosis came only when the last warning symptom of migraines belatedly made its appearance: visual disturbances. I was working at the computer in my office at CAS when I suddenly had trouble focusing on the screen. Then, glowing, scintillating chevrons began to march across my visual field. I thought I was having a stroke, and I called 911. By the time the ambulance got me to the hospital, all the other symptoms of my mystery disease had developed. I lost so many electrolytes with all my vomiting and diarrhea, they had to give me intravenous fluids to prevent electrolyte shock. From then on, I've always had to carry antiemetic tablets in a pill box in a pants pocket. At the slightest hint of nausea, I pop a pill to avoid the debilitation that would otherwise be inevitable. I would learn to label my mystery disease silent migraines only after my daughter Catherine began to experience real migraines, and I got her to a specialist. It was her doctor who actually put the correct label on my mystery disease. Long before I knew what to call it, however, I had figured out its cause. I traced the disease back to the brain concussion I had received in the diving accident I suffered when I was 13 years old, the accident that would end my budding career as a pianist. Unlike real migraines that involve the cerebral cortex, my disease, I believe, is triggered by scar tissue in the brainstem. It had to be located on the floor of the fourth ventricle of the brainstem at the back of my brain, right under the spot where my brother had struck with his heels when he cannonballed off the dock. It would act like an epileptic focus, which, when activated, would send a wave of depolarization to the nearby vestibular and emesis nuclei. That would trigger the dizziness, nausea, and vomiting that often accompany my attacks. Helps to be a neuroscientist. Clinging to the closet. When I was young, I had to do everything possible to conceal my homosexuality. The anti-sodomy laws in Michigan and elsewhere weren't just quaint statutes lingering in law books, inherited from an outmoded antiquity. During my first year at the University of Michigan, I learned of an African-American guy who had seduced the 19-year-old son of the Washtenaw County sheriff. After his fifth or sixth blowjob, the kid was seized by homosexual panic. He told Daddy. His seducer was sent to prison for life, the same penalty as that imposed for first-degree murderers in Michigan. It's hard to describe the paranoid terror that case instilled not only in me, but in many of the other gay men I knew at the time. Given the overpowering hormonal stimulation that was propelling me into outrageous, risky activities, I was living in a state of perpetual high anxiety as I pursued what Oscar Wilde called the love that dare not speak its name. Getting married in October of 1964 not only resulted in a stabilization of my emotional life, there would be no more suicide attempts after that. It provided cover. After Catherine was born, I felt safe from the malicious gossip that had made the misery of my college years. Was it a mariage de convenance, a marriage of convenience? Yes, in the sense that it provided benefits unrelated to love and affection. No, however, because the marriage had been contracted out of deepest affection, indeed love. So what if I never had sexual fantasies about Anne or any woman at all? I was able to satisfy her physical needs as fully as her psychological needs. I have fallen in lust hundreds of times, but only once have I ever fallen in love. The deep, almost desperate bond that joined me to Anne can be felt in one of the first poems I wrote to her after our marriage. Be with me, Anne. Be with me, Anne, when yonder birch stands shivering in the autumn air. Be with me when low-angled sun no longer scatters morning dew, when icy needles stab the grass. Be with me yet when gray days darken, sorrowing under snow-filled skies, when I shall want for spark to keep my winter hearth's dim life aglow. Be with me even in the spring, when from the druid oak is torn the last brown burnished mummied leaf, and phoenix-like new life exsurges. Be with me, Anne, be with me. By the time Catherine was born, exactly 8 months to the day after our wedding, the natural correctness of our marriage had become obvious to Anne upon the birth of Catherine. Our love is now the pulse of life, syncarnate in one common flesh, and beating single, full with life, our separate hearts are one. Now do our quondam's separate humors course consanguine through one vein, two living streams conjoined in flood, one river starts to see. adjusted now my varied tunes to your rhythmic, soft and steadfast beat, and harmonized for one to sing our separate songs. By the time of our first anniversary, I was ebullient, secure in knowing I had found a partner with whom to share both joys and sorrows, someone who would stick with me through thick or thin. To Anne, on our first anniversary, 12 million breaths of air have passed our lips since past the breath that said you'd be my wedded wife and scared me half to death. 58 billion miles and more, one trip around the sun. A dizzy race it is we've run, but hasn't it been fun? During the 3 years in which I was teaching science at public high schools, my sexual orientation had to be concealed at all costs. Even in 1967, when I became a professor at a branch of the State University of New York, it was a dark secret that dared not be revealed. But things were about to change. In June of 1969, as we were preparing to leave for Europe to take up a one-year leave of absence position teaching biology and geology at the American International School in Vienna, something completely unexpected happened: the Stonewall riots. As soon as I had returned to New York, I began cautiously but publicly to support the gay liberation movement to decriminalize homosexual acts between consenting adults. I gradually became aware of the propaganda value of a married, presumably straight, man defending the rights of gays. In a year or two, I would be joined by other liberal men on the faculty in calling for decriminalization. For a good measure, I became a vocal defender of women's rights, in particular abortion rights. For several years, I would be on the board of directors of Planned Parenthood in New York City. On the first anniversary of Roe v. Wade, in January of 1974, I was the lone counter-picketer at the first ever anti-abortion protest in the New York State Capitol at Albany. Major newspapers carried photographs of me carrying a picket sign sporting a coat hanger and the slogan, "Don't bring back the coat hanger." I hold the copyright on that. "One Man Stood Alone" was the title of one of the articles describing my standoff against several hundred compulsory pregnancy fanatics. In later years, I would demolish the national president of Right to Life, a woman, in a radio debate. Attacking a woman in defense of women's rights? Indeed. Ever since I cast off the patriarchal religion of my childhood, I have always claimed that the most fundamental right of all is the right to control one's own body. Any woman who denies that, in fact, tries to destroy that right, is not a feminist. She is a misogynist. Right to life is wrong even in its name. By the time I met Madalyn Murray O'Hair for the first time in 1976, it is conceivable that I could have come out of the closet safely, but I worried that doing so would expose the obvious self-interest that had hidden behind my pretending to be a straight man defending gay rights. And how would it affect Catherine? She was only 11 years old and had already suffered harassment, indeed, being pelted with stones because her father was an atheist. What would happen if her tormentors knew that she was the daughter of an atheist queer? I would not reveal my secret even to her until she was 15 and was no longer being harassed for atheism. My atheism had been well known long before I met Madalyn. My first public identification as an atheist had begun in 1959. However, once I had joined Society of Separationists, the precursor of American Atheists, I was confronted by a new fear. I had quickly become the public face for the atheist movement. How would coming out of the closet affect the atheist cause? Wouldn't it just add one more reason to hate atheists, those godless queers? By the early 1980s, Don Sanders and his partner, Mark Franceschini, had founded American Gay Atheists and had forged a loose relationship with Society of Separationists. Previously, Madalyn seems not to have been very accepting of homosexuality, but Don and Mark won her over completely. John Garth, her son, and Robin, her granddaughter, gave them their full support as well. By the 1990s, Don would become National Vice President of American Atheists itself, as well as President of American Gay Atheists. By the 90s, when in general it would have been reasonably safe for me to come out of the closet, I had painted myself into a corner, not just with Madalyn, but with nearly all my professional colleagues and friends, many of whom are here tonight. The thought of coming out of the closet to Madalyn became more and more problematic as I rose ever higher in her esteem. She was depending upon me more and more, both as a biblical scholar and as a science advisor to the organization. Moreover, she had real affection for Anne. Not only would she feel that I had been deceiving her all those years, she would realize that Anne, too, had been involved in the deception. Notoriously, Madalyn was a bit paranoid, given the long history of betrayals that she had endured. Would she conclude that I had been deceiving her in other ways as well? It was all well and good that she knew that Don and Mark were gay. They had announced that at the beginning, at the very first time she had met them. I, on the other hand, as year after year of deception followed another year and a year after of deception, I simply could not come out of the closet. Don and Mark respected my privacy to the ends of their lives. When Mark died of AIDS, Don flew Anne and me down to Houston, first class, to perform the memorial service for his beloved partner. Madalyn, John, and Robin drove down from Austin for the service, and all three were visibly stricken with unfeigned grief. One of the most famous pictures of the trio was taken after the ceremony had ended. Madalyn is seated in a wheelchair. Standing behind her, left to right, are me, Anne, Robin, and John. You can see the picture back there on that far wall after I finished reading. In almost all published versions of the picture, in all of the documentaries and things like that, in all of those, Anne's face and mine are blurred out. Like my face in that picture, my true self would remain blurred out to Madalyn to the end of her life in 1995. AIDS. Late in the autumn of 1982, shortly after I had returned from a short stay in New York City, I noticed that a dark brown mole-like growth had appeared on my lower right leg. Thinking at first that I was finally developing a melanoma, an almost always lethal type of skin cancer that I had feared since high school, I decided it didn't quite fit the diagnosis. I had never been sunburned on that part of my anatomy while working on the farm. Moreover, it simply appeared out of nowhere, whereas melanomas usually develop from a series of mutations in pre-existing moles. Newspapers and scientific journals had recently been reporting that Kaposi sarcoma, a rare type of cancer normally found in Africa, was being found in homosexual communities in New York and San Francisco. It wasn't possible to make a meaningful diagnosis on the basis of those reports, but my mystery growth was consistent with published descriptions. I had just been exposed to one of the communities being studied, and I was terrified. There were also curious reports that many of the gay men with Kaposi sarcoma also seemed immunocompromised to a dangerous degree. Despite my worries, I was too busy wrapping up my 20-year teaching career at Fulton Montgomery Community College and making arrangements for my relocation to Ohio to do anything about the lesion. I would start a new career on December 28th, 1982, thanks to Barbara. Inexorably, the growth slowly grew larger and larger. Within a month of arriving in Columbus and getting set up with a new health insurance program, I paid a visit to my new doctor. I requested a biopsy and removal of the growth, which he agreed to do. Over a week went by before I was called back to see my doctor. Although Kaposi sarcoma was clearly ruled out, the histology was abnormal, odd. That had also been the story with dozens of strange moles I'd had removed since I was a student in high school. Not knowing that Kaposi sarcoma was only one possible complication arising from a deadly underlying immunodeficiency, the term AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, would not be coined until 6 months later, in July of 1983. I breathed a sigh of relief and began to explore the Columbus bar scene. Only a few more months would go by, however, before I became more and more uneasy. A strange pneumonia was also affecting the gay community, even in Columbus. There were more and more indications that some immunological defect underlay all the peculiar diseases that were killing gay men. Killing gay men. Although Luc Montagnier at the Pasteur Institute had already linked a virus to the disease, I didn't know about it. It would only be a year later, in May of 1984, that I would learn of Robert Gallo's finding that HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, was the causative agent, the same virus Montagnier had found, but given a different name to. Frighteningly, no one knew how the virus was being transmitted. Did transmission require sexual contact? If so, what kind of contact? Anal sex? Oral sex? Kissing? It could be spread by blood transfusions, that was known, and the syringes shared by drug addicts. Could it be transmitted by sneezing? No one knew what could be ruled out, and near panic gripped the gay community of Columbus. A different hysteria swept straight society. Nurses were afraid to draw blood. To this day, they wear latex. Students who contracted AIDS from blood transfusions were refused re-entry into schools. Gay men who knowingly had infected others were being charged with murder. Homosexuals had become a serious threat to the broader society. This was no time to come out of the closet. In short order, several members of my newly created Central Ohio chapter of American Atheists developed AIDS and died. Several of my colleagues at work were stricken by the disease and were brutally kicked out of their closets by a lowly virus. In all cases where it was possible, I paid visits to the men to perform whatever humane service was possible. Privately, I was terrified doing that. I always avoided obvious physical contact with the afflicted, but who could know how I might contract the virus simply by being near them? Nevertheless, as one after the other of my friends and colleagues succumbed to the mysterious plague, a common bond quickly began to form, a bond that grew stronger and stronger with each successive loss. Despite my fears, I had to do it. Did I deserve to live more than they did? I had to do it. Only many years later would I learn that no heroism whatsoever was needed to do what I was trying to do. I had never been in any genuine danger. Apologia. By the 21st century, gay rights had become pretty much a given. It seemed like everyone had come out of the closet, even some TV and sports personalities. Everyone, that is, except me. The longer I had deceived my friends and colleagues, the more impossible it became to tell them that I had been deceiving them. In 2008, I became interim president of American Atheists itself. For 6 months, I was Madalyn's successor as leader in the atheist liberation movement. The public image of atheism itself now was at stake. I couldn't come out. Even after gay marriage was ruled constitutional, even when I myself would officiate at a gay wedding, I couldn't escape from my closet. And that's the way it would be. Until now. My story needs to be told while I'm still alive to be able to be held to account. And now I have told it. May my deceptions be forgiven. Amen. Thank you. I thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. And I don't know how much time we have left. Cara, how much more time do we have? Half an hour, okay. So please get a drink, and those of you who have a chance to talk with me this evening, and please take a look, if you haven't already, at my life as it's shown on the walls. All my books are there, and thank you all.